Tashdele, Nimila George Sigire, it's George FitzHerbert, and I na Chogi Pumpu Geti Shitong la Lekachegi. So my name is George. I speak in English because my Tibetan is not very good. But I started learning Tibetan more than 20 years ago, I guess, reading Tibetan. I first went to Tibet in 1993 as a youngster, only 18 years old, and I had an interest ever since that time. But I did a PhD in Oxford University, and then later I did some teaching in Oxford University in Tibetan Studies. And then just recently, 2022, I joined 84,000 as an editor, translating the Kagyur and Tengyur into English. So this is a really wonderful experience to work for this project because my background in Tibetan, reading Tibetan literature, I did a PhD on Gesar, on the Gesar epic, and I also did some research in Tibetan history for some years. But I never really studied Kagyur texts or read Kagyur texts. And since working for this project, I've read and I've edited so many texts, maybe in 2 years, maybe over 20 texts so far, sutras. And it's really like I learned so much from reading these texts about the Buddha Dharma, and what I like to call is the philosophical and emotional intelligence of Buddhism. So it's a really amazing thing. And also these texts, they put you in touch with what happened in Tibet all those centuries ago when the great Tibetan emperors sponsored the translation of these texts into Tibetan. And now we're reading the same texts more than 1,000 years later. It's amazing to me. Every week I'm amazed that it's possible to read these texts. Because if you take English, for example, you could take a text from the 12th century or 13th century and you wouldn't be able to read the script. You wouldn't be able to understand the language, even as an English speaker. But these Tibetan texts from 8th, 9th century, you can read them. They're written in simple Tibetan, grammatical and simple language. And for me, that's an amazing thing. So it's a real privilege to work as an editor, editing the English translations and checking the translations with the Tibetan language, but also editing the English to try and make it smooth and accurate and consistent in English. So I feel very, very lucky to have this job. It's wonderful. And that's really all I have to say. Dala said I should say something about future plans. The 84,000 project is a 100-year project, and only 15 years are past. So I have got no future plans except for working for the 84,000 project. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Jamyang, and thank you very much for asking me to come to the Shang Shung Institute to give this talk. And last time I was here was for a calligraphy workshop, Tibetan calligraphy workshop a few months ago, which was excellent. So glad to be back. And so Jamyang asked me to give a talk about my work, which is I did a PhD in Tibetan literature, and I worked in Tibetan history for some time, and then I taught for some years at Oxford University, teaching Tibetan and Tibetan Studies, and it was always on short-term contracts. And then I had the great fortune to get a job, with 84,000, this project to translate the Kagyur and Tengyur into English. So I feel very, very lucky to have got that job. I've only been doing it for 2 years now, and it's been fascinating, and I learn things every week, and so all good. So my intention today is just to give us talk introduction to this 84,000 project that I work for, and then if there's time, my idea was just to, as an example, look at a particular text that I worked on a few months ago, and just as a kind of example of some of the very diverse genres of text that we deal with in this amazing collection, the Kagyur. So that's my plan. So I've got a PowerPoint which I will now share. how does this work? Yes. It's already open. Maybe then I can go to slideshow like that, is it? Oh, okay, great. So, yes, so I'm going to race through some slides about the 84,000 project in general, and some people, you may know this already, you may know about this project. It's quite well known in Tibetan, Tibetan circles, so Tibetans mostly have heard of it. Most people who are studying Tibetan have heard of it. People who are practicing Buddhists have mostly heard of it because it's a very important project, I think. So I've just got some slides to just talk about it quite quickly. So it's a global non-profit initiative to translate the words of the Buddha and make them freely available to all. Non-profit initiative in the sense that it's funded entirely by donations. Scholars, scribes, and pilgrims, many who risked their lives in traversing mountain desert, ensured that the Buddha Dharma spread across nearly all of Asia. So, the legacies of Tibetan Buddhism, as Fabian was talking about, are so dependent on that translation work that happened in Tibet mostly in the late 8th and early 9th century. It was really like the real period of massive translation into Tibetan, and which was several hundred years after many of those same texts, Sanskrit texts, had been translated into Chinese. But mostly the texts were retranslated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and the Tibetan that we have now is by and large, a much more faithful record of those Sanskrit texts than the Chinese, which tends to transform texts. It's much harder to see how the texts relate back to the original Sanskrit from Chinese than it is from Tibetan. So it was an incredible translation project, and as Fabian mentioned, it was a state-sponsored translation project by the Buddhist kings of Tibet. And the first bilingual dictionary in the world was produced at that time. I believe the Mahavyutpati is the first bilingual dictionary ever produced in the world, which was a Sanskrit-Tibetan dictionary, which was actually happened quite late on in the project, in fact, back in early 9th century Tibet. So it wasn't so much that this dictionary and these translation terms were set and then the translation happened. It was actually relatively late in the process. So I think the Mahavyutpati dates to, is it around 816 or so, or it's early 9th century. And then you actually see in the colophons of a lot of Kagyur texts that it was translated by so-and-so and so-and-so, and then it was edited to conform with the new terminology. And that's a reference to the Mahavyutpati when they brought in by imperial decree this kind of standardization of translation terminologies. But anyway, so it's an incredible legacy how Buddhism spread across Asia and how Buddhism spread to Tibet. And we're sort of connecting with that by endeavoring to translate it now into English. So the great Dharma patrons of Tibet commissioned and facilitated the translation of Sutra and Shastra into Tibetan. And it's because of them that the world still has the 231,800 pages of the Tibetan Buddhist canon. So that's the Kagyur and the Tengyur combined. So the Kagyur meaning word of the Buddha. So that includes all the discourses, it includes all the perfection of wisdom, that some of them are extremely long, all of the discourses of the Buddha, and all of the tantras, and all of the dharanis, which are sort of condensed, often excerpts from other texts with mantras and so on. So the Kagyur encompasses all of that, and then the Tengyur is works by Buddhist scholars, i.e. not considered word of the Buddha, but works of Buddhist scholars that were then translated into Tibetan. So they were collected into two separate collections, the Kagyur and the Tengyur. This project has inherited these legacies and is endeavoring to do something, I don't know if we can say similar, but we're trying to do the same. What those Dharma kings in Tibet did in the 8th century, they translated the word of the Buddha into the vernacular language of Tibetans. And this was an instruction that the Buddha himself made very often and explicitly in his teachings, that you should teach in the language that people can understand. So this is something that's there in the texts themselves, this emphasis on vernacular language. And I'm not entirely clear on this, like what the textual source of it is, but I have it in my mind that that the Buddha also instructed, he didn't really want his teachings even translated into Sanskrit, because Sanskrit was an elite literary language at the time in India. And but anyway, that's after several hundred years after the Buddha's time, so we're talking as much as, well, 1,000 years after the Buddha's time. The texts of the Buddha's teaching were mostly in Sanskrit, and this was also, the Mahayana. The Mahayana had become the dominant form of Buddhism in India by that time, and so the way that the Buddha's discourses are framed is often in the framework of a Mahayana understanding. So all of that baggage, when you read these texts, you can see that this is not, when the Buddha talks about different types of Shravakas and Bodhisattvas, this layering of followers of the Buddha as in different traditions of Buddhism is, you can see this is slightly late superscriptions that have happened over time since the time of the Buddha. But that is what we have in Tibetan, is this record of late Buddhism. So the Buddhism that existed several centuries into what we call the Common Era, the Christian era, in India, that was translated into Tibetan, and now we can endeavour to translate into vernacular languages again, so into English, which is spoken by so many people in the world today. So that's the aim. It was started in 2009, a meeting in Bir in Himachal Pradesh at the monastery of Dzongtse Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, who's in the centre of that photograph. So it was his initiative, and he invited all these scholars and practitioners from around the world to discuss whether it was feasible to embark on a project of translating these texts. And by their estimation at that time, they estimated that about 5% of the canon had been translated into a Western language at that time, 2009. So then started this project. So we often talk about this dual mandate, like who are we translating for? So our aim is to translate every text in both the Kagyur and the Tengyur into English. We've barely started on the Tengyur, but Kagyur is quite well advanced now. And the idea is that we're making it available for people to read, and there's sort of we talk about our kind of readers often in two kind of slightly fantastical categories, because I think most people are one or are a blend of the two, which is practicing Buddhists to help inform their practice, and scholars and so on who are studying Buddhism in a more academic setting are our two sort of audiences. So we try to cater in our translations for people who are just coming at it from both those perspectives, and often in reality those two things are the same. I mean, people are interested in the text for both reasons. So it's an extraordinary project because I studied Tibetan for a long time. I studied Tibetan literature, and I did a PhD on the Gesar epic, actually, and then I did various researches into Tibetan history, and I've always found Tibetan very difficult. Like, even after, decades, basically 20 years of reading Tibetan, still find it difficult, still find it obscure, still find a lot of, especially spoken colloquialisms and just idiosyncratic language that I found there was no way to understand without consulting someone. And so the great revelation for me, working on Kagyur texts, to be perfectly honest, is that their intelligibility. So like Fabian was saying, these texts are really surprisingly intelligible. And in fact, Kagyur texts are written in a style of Tibetan that is in many ways easier than later genres of literature. So the literary language of Tibetan was actually, I think it's fair to say, was in a way created for the purpose of translating these texts. So the Tibetan alphabet was created for the purposes of translating Buddhist texts. It was an oral language that didn't have writing, and as people probably know, the kings of Tibet sent scholars to India to develop a writing system, and they developed what became the Tibetan script in order to translate Buddhist scriptures. And so those translations are like the foundation of Tibetan literature, and they have this kind of grammatical clarity, which is really wonderful for someone who's a foreigner who studied Tibetan And so I have a fairly decent grasp of the grammatical structure of how Tibetan works, but then I'm often at sea with certain idioms and so on. But the Kagyur texts are really very intelligible, and so it's a source of kind of daily wonder to me that like these texts are so legible, so readable, that you can really understand them. And like similar to what Fabian was saying, I actually have a copy of the Magna Carta at home from the British Library. And that's from, is that 12 something? It's completely unintelligible. The script is unintelligible. The words are unintelligible. It's really unintelligible. And these are texts that are mostly translated in the 9th century in Tibet, and they're intelligible. They're clear, simple language. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. That's not to say that they're completely easy. I mean, these texts often are very, very long. They can be very, very repetitive. They can have complicated structures narratively, and they can be full of terminology. In fact, they are full of terminology. But that's one of the things that 84,000 has been really brilliant at helping one read these texts, because we have glossaries and so on, so that terminological terms, you can simply click on them on an online format and you get the Tibetan, you get the Sanskrit, and you get an explanation of what that sort of phrase might mean. And you also have alternative translations, so you can see how different translators have translated the same term differently, which again can give you a sense of how to understand it. So yeah, it's a combination of these things: scholarly research, open access technology, and specialized translation. So the team has been growing. As I say, I'm a relatively new person in this team. I've only been there for 2 years. I think it's over 20 full-time employees now, from translators to editors to technical team. So this is what it looks like. So I'll just give you a quick sort of show and tell of the website, because there is an app as well, but the app is not as good as the website. So if you're ever going to go to this website, I would recommend you do it on a laptop or on a computer rather than on a phone. You can use it on the phone, and you can access texts and translations, but a lot of the kind of features of how to navigate around it aren't available on the app. So you go to the reading room, and then you have Kagyur and Tenjur. So we've barely started the Tenjur, but Kagyur, we're quite well advanced. So then you click on Kagyur, and then you get the different categories of texts that are in the Kagyur. And this is it's a hugely diverse collection. So that's one of the revelations. I was used to thinking of, you look at different categories of Tibetan literature, like Fabian was saying, you might read biographies, or you might read histories, or different types of Tibetan literature, and then you think, and Kagyur is just another category. But when you really go into this huge body of text, it's not at one category. It's several categories with very different styles and themes. And so discipline is the Vinaya. So this is the Mula Savastavad Vinaya. So this is the code of the monastic discipline that was adopted in Tibet, and is the code of monastic discipline for all the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So that's one category, is discipline, Dulwa. Then discourses, and then Tantra, and those are the three. And then 2 more categories, and then Dharani. So we have discipline, discourses, Tantra, and then Dharani, which is, as I was saying, Dharani means to remember, or like tools for recollection. So it's basically formulas or mantras that are used to recollect whole areas of teaching, or used as kind of spells for worldly purpose, sort of magical spells and so on. So there's a whole category of the Kagyur which is devoted to Dharani. And then there's the catalogue, which is a fascinating document itself. So this is it's not just the catalogue, it's 5 chapters. The last 2 chapters are catalogues, so all of the texts that are contained in the Kagyur. And the first 3 chapters are Situ Panchen's history of Buddhism, which end with the chapter 3, which is his account of how the Dege Kagyur was made. So that's an 18th century Kagyur that was made in eastern Tibet, and his chapter 3, we've just published that recently, and it's a really interesting read. Is the Situ Panchen's history of how the Dege Kagyur was made, and it includes his history of Kagyurs in general, from the imperial period, and then the collections, and then the Tselpa Kagyur, and the different lineages of Kagyurs, and how the Dege Kagyur was compiled in the early 1730s. So anyway, those are the categories. And then when you click on, so for example, back to those 5 categories, okay, we click on discourses there, then you get a whole lot of new categories. So these are the types of discourses. So you have the perfection of wisdom, then you have the Avatamsaka, the Ratnakuta. These are kind of historic collections of sutras. And then the general sutra section, which is mostly where I've been working for the last 2 years. And then you've got 13 late translated sutras. This was actually a Sri Lankan monk who came to Tibet in the 14th century. I'm hesitating on that. I think 14th century, late 14th century, I think, or even early 15th. And so there were 13 texts translated from Pali, actually, at that very late date. So most of these texts were all translated before the 13th century, when the first compilations were sort of set, apart from these ones which were a late addition. Okay, so the site has all these really interesting tools and features, and I thought I would just spend a bit of time showing you those features, because when I started working there, I was already aware of the 84,000 site, and I'd used it, and I was interested in it. But I've basically spent the last 2 years on that site constantly, and you just find it's an extremely rich and rewarding site to navigate and use for translation purposes. So source text view means that you can see the Tibetan text, so you can click on the folio number and you can see English translation Tibetan text. Cumulative glossary is, like I was saying, about terminologies, but it's cumulative, so you can see across text, so you can see alternative translations of the same term in different texts and so on. Translation memory is very useful in the translation process, because if you've got a phrase or a sentence and you're like, I bet this is in some other text, you can see if, so you could type in the Tibetan and you see how another translator may have translated the same sentence or phrase. And intertextual linkages is a kind of new area, because we're just starting to translate Tenjur texts, and the idea is, and this is already active just for one text, where you can read the root text and the commentary side by side. So we've done that for one text, Prajna Paramita, a Perfection of Wisdom commentary, where you can read the root text, the 18,000 or the 25,000 Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, and then with this commentary. So stage by stage, where you go, so this Indian commentary that was translated into Tibetan. So yeah, just to show each of those. So that's how you do text view. So you just click on the folio number as you're reading the translation. You click the folio number, you get the Tibetan text. The Tibetan text is not the text that we've translated from normally. So this is an e-text of the Dege Kagyur that we use from Esukya, which is based in Dharamsala. But so we don't actually use Esukya's e-text when we're translating. We use like the Dege print and the Pedurma, which is the critical edition published book version, which is, shows all variants from different Kagyurs from Beijing. And then we also use a stock palace Kagyur from Ladakh, which is a manuscript Kagyur, because the critical edition doesn't use any Kagyurs from the Tempangma recensional lineage, and so we have to always consult with at least one, and so we use the Ladakhi stock palace one. But yeah, but anyway, it gives you a sense. So even if it's not exactly necessarily identical words, there might be some differences here and there, but by and large, it'll only be maybe a few different, tiny differences. But basically, it is the text that we've been translating. So cumulative glossary, yeah, just to see how you get there, you go to Reading Room Collection. No, is that how you do it? Anyway, you have to. It's basically search. No, it's not like that. You just go to Reading Room. I think you just go search, and then you click that tab. So, this doesn't quite. Oh, maybe I'm thinking about. Sorry, I'm not quite. Sorry, ignore me. I'm not quite sure what I'm saying. I think I'm talking about the translation memory. But yeah, so the glossary of terms. This is the cumulative glossary. So you've got Tibetan, Sanskrit, and you've got our translation. So you could look up, for example, if you've got a name of a character or a person, a figure in these texts. You can find out what, by looking in the cumulative glossary, find out what text does this figure appear in. Lots of different things, terminologies, places, they're all in the glossary. So we have, places, people, and terms, 3 categories in our glossaries. This term or might be used in a text. And then you can see how it's been done in the glossary. So these are glossary entries. Are they glossary entries? No, maybe they're not. They're just translation memory. It says glossary. So these are where it's been glossarized. there's been a glossary entry for the term. But in other places, it'll just be the term has come up in the text, and you can see what the translator has done with it. And then intertextual linkages is what I was saying about reading a source text with a commentary side by side. So this is the first one that we've done like this. So this is this is Toku 9. So is this the 18,000? No, I think this is the 25,000. This is the Perfection of Wisdom, the Prajnaparamita, in 25,000 lines. So that's been published. The 18,000 has also been published. I think I recommend the 25,000. It's an English translation team as opposed to an American translation team. It depends on what kind of style of English you like. Yeah, so then we've got this commentary translated, Toku 3808. And so there you can see, you can read side by side the commentary with the root text. And then you can also, for example, in this tab here, you can have the source text, the Tibetan source text. So it's really in terms of how to read these texts, it's really it's a huge kind of possibilities for really understanding if you really want to spend time on these texts, looking at them in detail and closely. So that's what we've done. So blue represents the proportion of the Kagyur that is now published in English translation. But that's actually out of date. So I took that screenshot in January, and since then we've published the first 8 chapters of the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines, which is 3,000 pages. So that's moved that blue quite considerably further. And the sort of, this colour here is translations in progress. So either in the process of being translated or edited, or in markup. So it's really a large percentage now. And then these are awaiting, the sort of orange colour is awaiting publication, means that they're basically in markup, or they're in editorial process, quite late on in the editorial process. And only 9% still not begun. So, it normally takes a few years. It's about maybe 2 years for maybe longer, depending on the length of a text, but it's quite a long process. So quite often as an editor, I will receive a text and I'll see, when did they translate this? And it'll say 2021, so it's already 3 years ago that they translated it, and then I edit it, and then even after I edit it, it's be another 6 months before it comes to publication quite often, because there'll be copy editing and then markup. But there's also just a constant sort of checks. I have to say there's a lot of checking goes on. The texts go through, a lot of people read them before they get published. So of course things slip through, and of course there's a lot of mistakes. There will be mistakes. But it is quite thoroughly checked. And sometimes it feels like we don't each have enough time with the text. So everyone's on a kind of keep going. And so as an editor, it's 5 folios per day of line by line check. And it's actually quite a lot to get through. You can't think, oh, this is a really complicated idea going on here, and spend 2 days thinking about it. You have to keep going. And progress on the Tenjur is much less, so hardly begun. So the idea is it's a 100-year project from 2009. And we've already covered 15 years of that project, but we're at 30%. So it may be going a bit faster than anticipated, but the Kagyur is going to be, I think, a lot easier than Tenjur. I also think that the translations that were translated into Tibetan in the 8th and 9th century are written in this style that is much easier than even the sutra translations, or translations from the Kagyur that were made in the Chidar, from time of Atisha, and there's quite a lot of translations from that time. And the style is quite different, I would say, and I would say more difficult. It becomes more Tibetan. It's got a more Tibetan atmosphere to it. Whereas the Kagyur from the 7th, 8th century translations, it's quite mechanical in a way. It's like, they're translating from a foreign language with terminologies. Its grammar is very clear, and it's just very intelligible like that. and it gets more idiomatic, I feel. And then most of the Tenjur is translated later. So I think that linguistic diversity is going to, I think, make it more and more challenging, I'm sure. Okay, so then do I have any time? I mean, yeah, then I spent a few minutes as an example to talk about text, so I didn't know what to talk about. So, you know, the Kagyur is full of, I mean, it's just been a great learning process for me for the last 2 years. I continue to learn all the time. And there's so much philosophical richness in there, and there's also, you know, what I call the emotional intelligence of Buddhism, I feel like, is there a lot as well, you know. And so it's a hugely rich thing to be working on. But I'm just going to talk about something I thought relatively simple. And my idea was because, like Fabian was saying, like my assumption was a lay audience, if you like, a non-scholarly audience for this talk. And I thought that this text I worked on, briefly in fact, the verses on circumambulating stupas, I found it really rewarding to work on. I just found it sort of transported me to other times a little bit, and to the devotional side of Buddhism in a really kind of way that I found was great and fascinating. And then also the text, but then also what was interesting about this text from my point of view is that it's a very simple text on one level. It's, you know, it's about circumambulating stupas, so it's really for lay people. It's not a specialist text, you know. It's not philosophically complicated or anything like that. It's devotional. It's like an aspiration. It's basically this kind of like a song. It's like a sort of prayer for good rebirth. So, you know, if you circumambulate stupas, you'll have great rebirth, and it talks about the different great rebirths that you'll have, and it's like a song, you know, very repetitive. And but then when you start researching it, it has this incredibly rich cultural history, this text. So it has Sanskrit fragments, there are Khotanese versions, there's a Chinese translation, there's also iterations of these same verses in other Kagyur texts in the Vinaya. So it starts becoming this kind of complicated scholarly task to unravel these different versions of this text. And so I thought that was quite a good example of the challenges we face in this thing. Because it's not simply like one approach to translating such a text as this is to translate this lovely, this nice song about having great rebirth by circumambulating, doing kora. And that was kind of my approach at one point. But then the complexities of the textual history, you know, add a lot of difficulties. And anyway, the text then got passed on to one of the other editors, who's a Sanskritist, and then it kind of got transformed quite a lot again from what I did. So it's kind of an interesting case study of like what can happen to a text. And it's not perfect. Like what we end up publishing is often maybe, it's not what I would maybe prefer, and maybe it's not what the Sanskritist would prefer, but it's like a bit of a mix, maybe, a compromise, a bit. There is that element to our translations that they're a bit by committee. Most texts have been through at least 2 editors at some stage or another. So it's not like a consistent style, you know, often the text that we end up translating. So that's just maybe a drawback, but it's also a strength maybe. But so yeah, just talk a bit about the process. So you get a text for editorial, normally you've got a translation from someone, and then you look at least 3 versions. So you immediately take from the Dege xylograph. This is the Parpu. This is the first printing of the Dege Kagyur in 1737, and it's on TBRC. So that's our basic source. And the reason why we use the Dege, well, I could go into that, but maybe I won't, because it's really good. The Dege Kagyur is really good. And Situ Panchen, when he did the Dege Kagyur, he deliberately, it's a Tselpa lineage Kagyur, so it's based on the Litang Kagyur primarily, which was a few decades before. But he also used the Lodong Kagyur, which is an example of the Tempangma lineage Kagyurs, of which the Stock Palace, so that second one is a Stock Palace, the Ladakhi one, that's a Tempangma lineage Kagyur, which is often a bit different. Often, you know, lines will be in a different order, sometimes there'll be whole different lines, sometimes there'll be different verses, quite a lot of significant differences. So, and in some cases there are texts that aren't shared. But in most cases they are shared because Situ Panchen used a Tempangma lineage Kagyur when compiling the Dege Kagyur. So it's the Dege Kagyur is the first Tselpa lineage kanjur that also incorporates texts that are found in the Tenpangma lineage kanjurs. So that's why it's good. But if you're interested in the Dege kanjur, I recommend read chapter 3 of the Dege Karcha, which was recently published on the site. Really interesting. And then this is the Pedurma, the Kanjur Pedurma, which was produced in Beijing. So it's like a critical edition, which means so you have footnotes, and the footnote gives all the variant readings that you find in different kanjurs. But the Pedurma doesn't use any Tenpangma lineage kanjurs, so it's really only variant readings within Tselpa lineage kanjurs. So it's mostly like small orthographic differences or small like typo style differences. So they're not normally that significant. But yeah, so those three. That's the basic process. So anyway, so this, yeah, so about just translating these verses. I mean, for me, it was a learning process because I thought of Kora, it's just iconically very much about Tibetan expression of devotion to Buddhism. But it was a learning process to see, the terms and stuff which I didn't know about. But pradakshina is the term for, dakshina means the right hand, and pra is to go. So it means passing something to your right as a form of respect. So that's what's translated as kora. So when in these verses, when it says it's something like kora chepani, was it choten la kora chepani or something like that? Someone who does kora of a choten. And so I was thinking like, how to translate that? Oh, like doing rounds or getting into, if you want to translate into a rhythmic way into this song and doing rounds or something like that, so using some phrase like that. But then it's so different, the Sanskrit, the pradakshina is like passing on the right. So just an example of, if you were to translate from the Tibetan, you'd think of round. If you were to translate from Sanskrit, it's passing on the right. They're completely different translation. Question like that. And then choten, similar, well, not similar, but choten, it translates two terms in Sanskrit, chaitya and stupa, and they are, in some contexts, interchangeable terms, it seems, but chaitya seems to be of a broader designation, maybe, whereas stupa is very much the stupa, these, this shape, the domed reliquaries, or, symbolizing body, speech, and mind. So how to translate that term? If you translate it as stupa, but in the text it says chaitya, you're sort of changing one Sanskrit term for another Sanskrit term in your English translation. So, so anyway, I think we went for shrine in the end, for choten. Yeah.
No equivalent.
What?
There's no equivalent, is there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, choten, I think shrine is quite a good translation potentially for choten, just as in, ch is like to worship or to make offerings, or so support for worship. I think support for worship and shrine are pretty closely aligned, sort of. I don't know I don't know what the etymology of shrine is, but it's a difficult one. Because also, Tibetans will do circumambulation of all kinds of, lakes and mountains and monasteries, which aren't choten exactly, they're not stupas. But then, is this text about that? No, I don't think it is. I don't know. It's difficult. So I'm just sharing with you difficulties of the task, really. But so the text itself is quite simple, like I was saying. It's Shariputra, the Buddha's disciple, asks the Buddha a question, and then he says, "What are the benefits that come from the practice of this pradakshina?" And then he speaks these verses. And then I just want to talk about the complexities of like the textual history of these verses. So just on the Tibetan context, there we have there's a fragmentary inscription of these texts in Tibetan in Ladakh at Alchi, at the Sumsek in Ladakh, in the Choten opposite. It's inscribed there. So there's been a lot of scholarship on all of these things. So there's a lot of scholarship on Alchi, a huge amount of like art historical scholarship and so on. But then also in the Gilgit Buddhist manuscripts, there's at least two versions of these verses in those Gilgit Buddhist manuscripts. So these were recovered in Gilgit, today northern Pakistan, in the 1930s. And they are, I've read somewhere on a UNESCO site, but I don't know if I can trust UNESCO, the oldest surviving manuscripts in India. But they're not, I think they're dated to around 6th century. But, physical manuscripts that date from that time. Because most manuscripts in India, because of the climate, they deteriorate. And, so there's not a culture of actual old manuscripts in India because of the climate. But, so 2 versions, but very difficult to read, not only because damaged and fragmentary, but also written in this Sharada script, which, only certain specialists in Sanskrit would be able to read. So certain amounts, quite a lot of scholarship on those Gilgit Buddhist manuscripts, and especially in Japan, quite a lot of scholarship, Japanese scholarship. Then on the right, that's an English translation of a Khotanese version of a Dunhuang manuscript written in Saka language of a Khotan and translated by Bailey, so quite an early translation. So there's that. There's also a Chinese translation made in the late 7th or early 8th century by Shikshananda, and we didn't consult that. So, there's a lot we don't consult. So it's like, most you can, well, maybe not most you can do, but I think it's our obligation to flag all this information. But then you're taking away from the fact that this is a simple song about the benefits of circumambulating stupas. So that's really the thing I wanted to highlight, is like, where do you draw the line? How do you present such texts? And also, so various verses are found in different parts of the Kagyur. The Avalokiteshvara Sutra, verses for Prasenajit, and some Vinaya texts have crossover verses. So it becomes quite a complex task. And then in the course of editing, I don't know why my slideshow has... so in the course of editing, then when it got passed on to another editor who's a Sanskritist, so my specialization is much more Tibetan, his is much more Sanskrit. And there's actually a full Sanskrit manuscript of this in Cambridge, in the Cambridge University Library, which hadn't even been labeled. They didn't even have the title of it. It's because it's with another text, so it's with Prasenajit, the verses for Prasenajit, King Prasenajit. And so it was kind of a second text in the same, thing, which was, I think, purchased in Nepal in the 19th century. So it's not like most manuscripts. Sanskrit manuscripts it's not old. It's relatively modern as an actual physical thing. But there's a kind of presumption that when you have a Sanskrit manuscript, this is the text from which the Tibetan was made. And so that's a complicated question always. But anyway, the other editor had a look and seemed to think that there was quite a close correspondence between this Sanskrit manuscript and the Tibetan translation. And the Tibetan translation, we don't know exactly when it was made. It doesn't have a colophon, but it's listed in the Denkarma and Pangtangma imperial catalogues, so it's probably imperial period translation, 9th century, 8th, 9th century, but we don't know for sure. Because because there's no colophon, we don't know if this is that translation that's listed in those catalogues, or it could be a later translation. And why have I included that? Because I was recently in Maharashtra and I went to Ajanta and Ellora. And after having worked on this text, and then part of the cave monasteries in Ellora, the cave monastery there, is the Chaitya Hall. And so I was just like, this is really what this text was describing as well, because it's sort of similar, I don't know that similar period, but I think I did get a bit confused there. I think it's around 5th century. I'm not sure. Okay. But it was fascinating to go there, and it had the little circuit route, so you could walk around it. Like in modern Tibetan monasteries where you can do the Kora route. So this is the text. At this point, I'm not quite sure what to do. I just thought I should give it a sense of it. See, the thing about this text, the language, the Tibetan, is very simple. The temptation is to translate it in a very nice, simple, folky way, because the subject is also, it's about just devotion. It's not for people with great training or who've studied philosophy or thought about deconstructing the experience of phenomena or such like things. It's really a devotion to Buddhism text, and it's a kind of wonderful story, the story it tells. So it says, by doing this, you'll be reborn in a happy family and with good, physically good, and have fortunate rebirths. And then it goes on to you'll be born as a Kshatriya or a Brahmin, so always a caste, but with good circumstances. And then you'll be born as a god. And then it goes through the various god realms, and you'll be born as in the different realms of the gods, and you'll be born as the king of the gods. So it's like this kind of journey, and you can almost imagine, as you're doing Akora, it's like a kind of journey through these possible blissful rebirths that you might experience by doing this, and then you'll be reborn again as a human, and then it kind of goes round like that. So I thought it was a really interesting and lovely text, although it's definitely got cultural baggage. There's stuff there that would, for modern audiences, a little bit uncomfortable. You'll never be born a cripple. You'll never be, stuff like that. So that's always difficult as well in these texts. You have stuff that, for modern sensibilities, can be a bit like jarring. So this is you'd be born as a Kshatriya or a Brahmin or Vaishya. And then be reborn again as human, and entering the womb, and it gives the whole, almost like the whole story. You enter the womb and be happy in the womb, and then be born without pain, So it's really tempting. For me, anyway, it's very tempting. Like, you just want to rewrite this as a sort of in a more, making it meaningful now type of way. But then when you've got this cultural baggage and all these Sanskrit manuscripts and different legacies, this is a text with so much cultural history that you're sort of tied to it. And certainly in the context of translation for 84,000, we've got to keep just simply to the text and try to. And then, I don't know, so rounds of shrines. This is actually, I've kept those. That's from an old version where I had this make rounds of shrines, but I think it's not going to be like that now. But then I just want to make one observation about and then I'll finish, about the translation, the difficulties of translation choices. So also it's a complex text because it seems like I thought that the Tibetan text was stitched together, maybe 3 texts, because it starts off with these structure of verses, and then it changes, and then you have like 4 verses which are in a different structure, different length of the lines, and then it changes to a different structure where you have 6-line verses. 6-line verses. And so it almost seems like different texts stitched together, and that is the feeling one gets. But then the Sanskrit manuscript in Cambridge actually has exactly the same structure. So it's not stitched together at the Tibetan stage, if you know what I mean. It's been stitched together earlier, or maybe. I mean, you never fully know, but this thing of a single step of circumambulation here. So these verses are actually found identically in the Vinaya, where they're in a different context, and it's when Anathapindada, as he called it, Anathapindada, who was the patron, he was a great merchant who donated Jetavana, one of the early monasteries. He donated to the Buddhist community, to the Buddha and his followers. And Anathapindada, so his park was known as Jetavana, Prince Jeta's grove. It's one of the early monasteries. And when Anathapindada first met the Buddha, these verses come in the context of that story, and that by taking one step, every step he takes towards the Buddha will lead to these great, wonderful things. So it's a different context, but the same verses. So just observing these complexities, I suppose. But this was, I thought, quite an interesting one as well, because then you get to the last section, and you get these verses which I found very moving, where it's like, all this amounts of gold, and all these amounts of gold, not equal to a single offering, made with a joyful mind by one who is learned, so kepa, so one who has looked at phenomena and thought about phenomena and, kepa. So it's how to translate kepa can be difficult. But then kepa translates 2 terms in Sanskrit. So it can translate pandita, which can mean scholar, but it can also translate vidvas, which means one who has knowledge, knower. But then Kepa for me, yeah, just in the context of the Kagyur text, Kepa very much does mean someone who has examined phenomena and has thought about the philosophies of emptiness, essentially. But yeah, so with this, just one who makes these very small things with a joyful mind. So I was quite moved by that. So when I went and visited that Chaitya hall in Ellora, I made sure to be a little joyful as I walked around the Chaitya. But then it was very interesting because this other editor is like in the Sanskrit manuscript, it's a different word. So prasana chitta, and prasana or prasada is sort of often translated as faith, confidence, serene faith, confidence, something like that. So it's been translated into Tibetan with this gawe semgi, with the mind of joy or happiness. So that's just kind of example of like, so then when you come to translating it, then, his inclination was maybe we should go back to the Sanskrit and translate this as with serene faith or something like that. And the Tibetan says with this joyful mind. So just sharing with you the what goes on. And then I think that's pretty much, that's me. So, sorry, that's not me, that's... Dzongso Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche is like the person who started this project and under whose inspiration basically donations are given to the project. So he's really like the head of the whole project. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What do I do?
I'm just going to say thank you very much, George, and huge, ambitious, wonderful project. So best of luck on it for the next 100 years. Hope you'll be alive for the whole.